10 ancient professions that vanished overnight, and no record explains why. Somewhere in the ancient world, a man bent over a still warm carcass and read the future in its liver. Somewhere else, a woman stood in a palace corridor and carried the names of every noble in the room inside her memory, like a living archive. And somewhere else still, a guild of engineers gathered in a sealed room, mixed a substance no one outside that room was ever meant to understand. And then they were gone. Not just the people, the entire profession, the knowledge, the tools, the language, the lineage. Gone. History has preserved its emperors, its generals, its philosophers, and its saints. But the workers, the practitioners, the specialists who kept civilization breathing from underneath, many of them left no final record, no last diary entry, no court document, no ship log, no farewell, just absence. 10 ancient professions once existed across the world's greatest civilizations. They were practiced for centuries, some for millennia. They were essential. They were respected. In some cases, they were feared. And then, for reasons history has never satisfactorily explained, they stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, not through quiet retirement, overnight. The records end. The practitioners vanish. The knowledge collapses. How does an entire profession disappear not only from the world, but from history itself? Before we follow these professions into their silence, we must understand what they were, because these were not obscure hobbies. These were not fringe practices. These were formalized, institutionalized, socially embedded occupations passed from master to apprentice across generations. The first profession, the Etruscan haruspex, a diviner of the ancient Mediterranean world, specifically from Etruria, in what is now central Italy, whose specialty was examining the entrails of freshly sacrificed animals and reading within them the will of the gods. The liver was the primary organ of interpretation. Actual bronze models of sheep livers have been found, divided into regions, each labeled with the name of a deity. This was not superstition. This was a codified, teachable system with its own curriculum, known as the Etrusca Disciplina, a complete body of sacred knowledge passed through designated priestly families. The second, the Roman nomenclator, a specialized slave, or later a freedman, whose singular, extraordinary function was to accompany wealthy Roman politicians and memorize the names, faces, family connections, and social histories of every person their patron might encounter. When a senator entered a crowded forum, his nomenclator whispered in his ear, this man's name, his debts, his alliances, his enemies. They were living databases, human networks. Their knowledge was so intimate, so operationally critical, that their loss would have been catastrophic for the political lives they served. The third, the Silphium cultivator of Cyrene. North Africa, in the ancient Greek colony of Cyrene, modern Libya, there grew a plant called Silphium. It was so valuable it appeared on Cyronian coins. It was used as a contraceptive, a flavoring, a medicine, a cure for fever and warts and plague. It could not be cultivated artificially. It grew only in a specific microclimate along a narrow coastal strip. And an entire professional class farmers, harvesters, processors, traders built their lives entirely around this single plant. The fourth, the Egyptian Kuri-Hebet, the lector priest. In ancient Egypt, these were the keepers and readers of sacred texts. They carried their scroll cases on their shoulders. They alone could correctly pronounce the divine words, the spells in the funerary texts, the ritual instructions of the Book of the Dead. Their voices, not just the words, but the precise phonetic rendering of them, were believed to animate the magic. Pronunciation was everything, and that pronunciation was never written down. The fifth, the Byzantine Greek fire engineer. Somewhere in the Eastern Roman Empire, most likely Constantinople, a small and closely guarded group of craftsmen knew how to manufacture Greek fire, a substance that burned on water, that could not be extinguished with water, that was deployed from bronze tubes mounted on warships and turned the surface of the sea into a river of burning liquid. It defeated naval invasions. It preserved Byzantium for centuries. Its formula was never recorded in any surviving document, and the people who made it simply disappeared from the historical record. The sixth, the medieval cinetor. documented primarily from Wales, Scotland, and the English borderlands between roughly 1000 and 1800 CE, though the practice may be far older. The sin-eater was a person, often desperately poor, who was summoned to the home of a dying or newly dead individual. A plate of food bread, salt, sometimes ale was placed on the chest of the corpse. The sin-eater consumed it. In doing so, they ritually absorbed the sins of the dead, allowing the deceased to pass into the afterlife unburdened. They were paid, they were essential, and they were utterly reviled, avoided in life, never touched, never spoken to except in the moment of need. Their existence documented almost entirely by accident. The seventh, the Aztec Pachteca. Before the Spanish conquest of 1519, the Aztec Empire maintained a formalized, hereditary, guild-based class of long-distance merchants. The Pachteca did not trade locally. They traveled to the edges of the known world into jungles, across deserts, through hostile territories carrying luxury goods, jade, feathers, gold, cacao, obsidian. They operated under their own laws, their own courts, their own deity, Yaxcoatl. They trained their children in their trade, and they were so embedded in Aztec economic and political life that the empire itself could not have functioned without them. The eighth, the Greek rhapsode. In ancient Greece, before writing was widespread, the professional rhapsode was the living library of an entire culture. They memorized and performed the Homeric epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and countless other works now lost entirely. They competed at festivals. They performed for nobles and common citizens alike. Their memorization techniques were so precise that scholars believe their oral transmission preserved these poems almost without error across centuries. The rhapsodes were not mere entertainers. They were custodians of cultural memory. The ninth, the woad dyer of pre-Roman Britain and Gaul. Before synthetic dyes, before indigo importation, the blue that colored cloth across northern Europe came from woad, a flowering plant whose leaves, when fermented through a precise and physically demanding multi-stage process, produced a rich blue pigment. The Celtic peoples of Britain and Gaul were not simply farmers who happened to grow it. There was a specialist class dyers with inherited knowledge who understood the fermentation chemistry, the temperature management, the seasonal harvest windows. Caesar and Tacitus both noted the strikingly blue-stained bodies of warriors. Behind those warriors were the people who made the dye. The 10th, the Minoan palace scribe of Linear A on the island of Crete between approximately 1800 and 1450 BCE. The Minoan civilization maintained a sophisticated administrative bureaucracy. Hundreds of clay tablets survive, inscribed with a script called Linear A. These tablets record what appear to be inventories, goods, quantities, names, transactions. They were the work of a professional scribble class trained, literate, institutionalized, and then the palaces collapsed. Linear A has never been deciphered. Not a single word of it is understood today. The scribes who wrote it are gone. Their language is gone. And with it, everything they recorded. These were not marginal figures. These were civilization's hidden infrastructure, each of them occupying a role that took years, sometimes lifetimes, to master. And they all disappeared from the record with a completeness that is, in itself, deeply strange. To understand how professions vanish, you must understand the worlds that swallowed them. The Etruscan civilization did not fade gently. Rome absorbed it culturally, politically, violently. By the 1st century BCE, Etruscan as a spoken language was effectively dead. The families that carried the Etrusca disciplina were Romanized. Their children spoke Latin, their grandchildren had Roman names, and the sacred knowledge, the haruspical system, was briefly adopted by Rome as a curiosity, a managed superstition, before being slowly sidelined and finally suppressed as Christianity rose. The Roman Empire itself was a civilization in permanent administrative crisis. Its archives were physically distributed across an empire spanning 3 continents. Fires, invasions, administrative reorganizations, the records of entire provinces were lost routinely. The nomenclators left no written accounts of what they knew precisely because their knowledge was never meant to be written down. In ancient Egypt, the centralized priestly institutions that trained and sustained the lector priests collapsed across centuries of conquest, first Assyrian, then Persian, then Greek, then Roman. Each conqueror brought a new administrative language, a new religious structure, new priorities. The temples that housed the training systems were closed, converted, or destroyed. The specialized phonetic knowledge held in the minds of living practitioners had nowhere to survive. Byzantium was a civilization of state secrets. The Greek fire formula was a state monopoly. It was deliberately not recorded in transmissible form. When the dynasty that controlled its production collapsed, and when the specific workshops and engineer families were disrupted, there was no document to reconstruct it from. The secrecy that protected it in life ensured its death. In Mesoamerica, the Spanish conquest was not merely military, it was archival. The Spanish burned codices. They dissolved the Calpulli, the clan-based occupational guilds that structured Aztec society. The Pochteca's own records, their guild documents, their training lineages, most were destroyed in the decade following 1519. What survives was recorded secondhand by Spanish priests, through interpreters, under colonial duress. The world of pre-Roman Britain left no native written record at all. Every account of the Woad Dyers comes from external observers, Roman generals writing in Latin about people they considered barbaric. Those observers had no interest in understanding the chemistry of blue dye. They noted the color. They did not note the people who made it. These were worlds where documentation was a privilege of power. The poor were not counted. Women were registered only in relation to men. Slaves were listed as property, not persons. Colonized peoples were observed from the outside, never from within. The archive itself was a tool of the powerful, and what the powerful did not value, the archive did not preserve. In such a world, disappearing was easy. You did not need to be murdered. You did not need to flee. You simply needed to be ordinary, needed, essential, and then no longer needed. This is the heaviest moment, because for each of these professions, there is a last record, not a dramatic final entry, not a farewell address, just a routine document that happens to be the last. For the Etruscan haruspices, a decree dated to 408 CE, issued under the Emperor Honorius, ordering the permanent closure of pagan sanctuaries and the prohibition of haruspical practice as a form of sorcery. One final official condemnation. After that, no further mention of a practicing haruspics in any surviving document. For the Roman nomenclator, references in the writings of Cicero and Pliny, men who found the practice mildly embarrassing. Essential, the last known mention is casual, an offhand reference in a letter, no announcement of the role's ending, just a silence in the texts that follows. For the silphium cultivators of Cyrene, Pliny the Elder, writing around 77 CE, states that the last known stalk of silphium was sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. He describes it in the past tense. The cultivators had already ceased to exist. The plant was gone, and so were they. One line in a natural history, that is their entire obituary. For the Egyptian lector priests, the last known dated reference to an active Kuri-Hebet performing funerary ritual comes from a papyrus in the 3rd century CE. After the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, the Egyptian temples were closed by law. No further records of lector priests in active practice exist after approximately 400 CE. For the Greek fire engineers, the last recorded successful deployment of Greek fire in naval combat is documented in Byzantine chronicles during the siege of Constantinople in 941 CE. After the political upheavals of the following century, the references stop, not an explanation, not a note of the formula being lost, just accounts of battles where it was no longer used. The silence is the only documentation of its disappearance. For the Aztec Pochteca, the last substantial account of their guild operations comes from Sahagun's Florentine Codex, compiled between 1545 and 1590. Decades after the conquest, from the memories of surviving elders, these men were describing a world already gone. They spoke in the past tense about their father's profession. By the time the ink dried on those pages, the Pochteca as a functional institution had been dissolved for a generation. For the medieval senator, the final documented case appears in an 1825 letter written by an antiquarian named John Aubrey, who recorded the tradition secondhand from Welsh informants. The last confirmed recorded instance of an actual sin-eating ritual is from a Shropshire village in the early 19th century. After that, the practice is described only in folklore scholarship. The last known Sinator left no name in any record. Each of these final traces has the same quality. Not a conclusion, not an ending, just a last moment before absolute silence. After this document, nothing. After this line, no more. Did anyone look for these people? Did anyone ask what happened? In most cases, no, because these were not the kinds of people that powerful institutions searched for. When the Etruscan haruspical families were absorbed into Roman culture, there was no investigation into what was lost. Rome's interest was in control, not preservation. When practicing haruspices were persecuted under later Christian emperors, no one petitioned on their behalf. Their suppression was the point. The Greek fire formula generated more post-disappearance attention than almost any other case on this list, precisely because its military value was so obvious. Byzantine chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries made references to it as a lost art. Medieval Arab scholars attempted to reconstruct it. Modern chemists have proposed dozens of candidate formulas: naphtha, quicklime, pine resin, various combinations. None can be confirmed, because the engineers left no documentation. Their secrecy was absolute. Their silence was professional. For the Aztec Pachteca, the Spanish colonial administration made no organized attempt to document guild knowledge before dissolving the guilds. Their interest was replacement, not understanding. The Franciscan friar Sahagun, who compiled the most detailed surviving account of Aztec professional life, was working against time, against colonial indifference, and against deliberate suppression by church authorities who viewed his project with deep suspicion. Parts of his manuscript were confiscated. He died before it was fully published. The obstacles to tracing these professions are layered with almost architectural precision. Records destroyed in the burning of Alexandria, which was not one fire but a gradual institutional decline spanning centuries. Records lost in the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, which destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate's enormous archive, along with whatever knowledge of ancient professional traditions it held. Records damaged in the systematic dismantling of the Aztec administrative apparatus. Records that were never created because no one considered the knowledge of a poor Welsh ritual performer worth documenting. Misspelled names created archival chaos. The same professional title transliterated from Egyptian Demotic into Greek, into Latin, into medieval Latin, could produce 3 or 4 completely different-looking words, all referring to the same role, making cross-referencing nearly impossible without specialist knowledge. And identity confusion. When a profession dissolves, its practitioners do not disappear physically. They survive. They take other work. They become something else. A lector priest becomes a village elder. A Pachteca merchant becomes a colonial labor conscript. A rhapsode becomes a tavern storyteller. But the professional lineage dies. The knowledge dies. The specific, irreplaceable, accumulated understanding of how to do this particular thing is gone with the last practitioner who did not teach it to anyone. History loses people. History loses entire occupations, not through drama, through bureaucratic failure, through the simple, grinding indifference of whoever held the quill. 3 frameworks help explain these vanishings. None of them fully satisfy. Theory 1, the most historically plausible: civilizational collapse and institutional discontinuity. The most evidence-supported explanation for most of these disappearances is straightforward: these professions required stable, centralized institutions to survive. When those institutions collapsed or were conquered, the professional pipelines broke. The lector priests required temple complexes, training institutions, libraries, continuous funding from temple economies. When the Roman Empire criminalized Egyptian paganism and the temples were forcibly closed, the training infrastructure ceased to exist. The last generation of practitioners died with their knowledge intact and nowhere to transmit it. This is not mysterious. It is the predictable outcome of institutional destruction. The Minoan linear scribes require no conspiracy theory. The palace economies of Crete collapsed around 1450 BCE, possibly from volcanic activity, possibly from Mycenaean invasion, possibly from internal upheaval. The palaces that housed the scribes and funded their training were gone. Without patronage, without purpose, the scribal class dissolved. Within a generation, no one was being trained. Within 2 generations, no one alive could read what their grandparents had written. The Pochteca are perhaps the clearest case, a conquistador-era institutional disruption on a documented timeline. Theory 2: voluntary dissolution and adaptation. Not all these disappearances were imposed from the outside. The woad dyers of Britain and Gaul may not have been suppressed. They may have adapted. As Roman trade networks brought new dyes and new methods into the region, the specific professional specialization of the woad dyer may simply have been absorbed into a broader textile economy, losing its distinct identity. The last woad dyer didn't die dramatically. They may have simply stopped calling themselves by that name and started calling themselves a cloth merchant. The Roman nomenclators may have evolved similarly. As literacy spread, as written lists and correspondence became more practical tools for political networking, the specific need for a walking human memory may have gradually reduced. The profession didn't vanish. It was perhaps outcompeted by the written word. The senator may have continued operating under different names, in different forms, well into modernity, absorbed into folk medicine, into local priest-like roles, into the general category of the local oddity who performed rites that proper religion didn't quite cover. Professions adapt, merge, rebrand. Their disappearance from the record may reflect a change in terminology as much as a change in practice. Theory 3: institutional silence and deliberate suppression. The third possibility is the most uncomfortable. Some of these professions were eliminated because their elimination served a purpose. The Etruscan haruspices were formally prohibited, not because they were ineffective, but because we were competing with Christian authority. A system that claimed to read divine will through liver inspection was a direct challenge to a system that claimed exclusive access to divine will through scripture and clergy. The prohibition was not incidental, it was strategic. The Greek fire engineers may not simply have died out. Their knowledge may have been deliberately held within a small, controllable group by the Byzantine state, and when that state chose to stop manufacturing the weapon or lost control of the specific families that held the knowledge, the silence that followed may have been partly intentional. A state that wanted to forget it ever had a weapon capable of that kind of destruction had good reason not to document how it was made. The Pochteca's guild records, their legal frameworks, their training documents, these were not accidentally lost. They were dissolved by an administration that found the existence of an independent, wealthy, legally autonomous indigenous merchant class politically inconvenient. History does not always forget by accident. Sometimes forgetting is a policy decision. This is the core of the silence. Because each individual explanation, conquest, institutional collapse, suppression, adaptation applies to a specific case. But all 10 of these professions share a deeper commonality. And that commonality is this: none of them were the people history was designed to remember. The archive, throughout most of human history, was a tool of the state and the church. Its purpose was to record transactions of power, the transfer of land, the collection of taxes, the names of rulers, the outcomes of battles. It was not designed to record the names of the people who made the blue dye for the warrior's battle paint. It was not designed to preserve the phonetic instructions for pronouncing a sacred Egyptian word. It was not designed to honor the poverty-stricken man who ate bread from a corpse's chest so that a stranger could rest in peace. These professions were essential. They were not valued in the archival sense. There is a specific kind of historical invisibility that attaches to practical knowledge. The blacksmith who forged the weapons of a great battle is forgotten. The general who ordered the charge is remembered. The engineer who designed the aqueduct is sometimes recalled in passing. The laborers who dug it are not. Women practitioners, the midwives, the herbalists, the ritual performers, who likely played central roles in several of the traditions on this list, face a compounded invisibility. The medieval senator appears in the historical record, almost always as male, but there is no reason to believe women did not perform this role. The record simply does not document them. Women were recorded in relation to property and family. Their professional practices were invisible to the same scribes who found their economic and social lives largely beneath notice. The colonized vanish with additional completeness. The Pochteca did not simply lose their guild. They lost the right to tell their own story. Every account of their profession that survives was filtered through a colonial lens written by people who were simultaneously documenting and destroying the civilization they were describing. What was preserved was what the colonizer found interesting or useful. What was not preserved was everything else. The poor leave almost no trace at all. The senator was, by definition, someone desperate enough to absorb a stranger's sins for a few coins. They had no property to record in a land transfer, no military rank to note in a campaign record, no church affiliation to document in a parish register. They existed at the furthest margins of an already marginal documentary tradition. When they stopped practicing, they did not even leave a last entry, and competing events accelerated the forgetting. When an empire collapses, when a city is sacked, when a plague sweeps through a continent, the losses that survive in memory are the visible, dramatic ones. The disappearance of a professional tradition that was already underdocumented simply does not register against the scale of the visible catastrophe. These professions were lost in the noise, because history is not a complete record. It is a curated selection, and the curators were not interested in them. The silence has not gone entirely unexamined. For some of these professions, modern scholarship has partially recovered what time buried. The Etruscan haruspices are perhaps the best documented case of modern recovery. The surviving bronze liver model, the Piacenza liver, has been analyzed exhaustively. Etruscan linguistic scholarship has made modest progress. The basic mechanics of the haruspical system are now reasonably understood. What remains lost is not the structure, but the experience, the living practice, the oral tradition, the nuance of interpretation that no written document can fully reconstruct. The Greek fire mystery has attracted chemists, historians, and military historians for centuries. A significant scholarly consensus has formed around naphtha-based compositions, crude oil distillates combined with quicklime, and possibly other additives. John Haldon and Morris Byrne published a detailed technical analysis in 2006 that represents the current state of scholarly understanding. But no formula has been confirmed. The engineers are still silent. Digital archival technology has been transformative for Linear A, the corpus of Minoan and Mycenaean stamps, the Damos database at the University of Oslo, and ongoing computational linguistics projects have cataloged every known Linear A inscription. Machine learning has been applied to find patterns. The signs themselves are mapped. The underlying language remains opaque, possibly related to no known language family. The scribes are still, in the most complete possible sense, untranslatable. DNA analysis has not been directly applied to professional lineage tracing. In most of these cases, it isn't the right tool for occupational history. But genetic archaeology has contributed indirectly. Population movement studies have helped reconstruct the disruptions, the conquest waves, the migration patterns that broke the transmission. Chains of multiple professional traditions. For the senator, modern folklorists and anthropologists, most notably Ronald Hutton in his work on British pagan and folk traditions, have attempted to trace the practice's origins and distribution. The consensus is that the practice existed, was geographically specific, and faded in the 19th century as organized religion consolidated its authority over death rituals. No living practitioner, no unbroken tradition, just archived accounts. The silence, in most cases, remains. Modern tools have made the contours of that silence clearer. They have not yet filled it. Set aside the historical analysis for a moment. Think about the last Etruscan man who knew how to read a liver. He had been trained by his father. His father had been trained by his grandfather. There was a lineage stretching back not decades but centuries. He had memorized the 70 regions of the bronze model. He had memorized the names and attributes of the deities that governed each zone. He had performed this ritual hundreds of times. He had stood in a temple and spoken words in a language that was already dying while he spoke them. And when he died, there was no one to teach, not because no one was interested, because the temples were closed, because the students were gone, because the world that needed what he knew had been replaced, officially and legally and violently, by a world that did not. He died with a complete education inside his skull, and it died with him. Think about the last Mexican elder of the Pachteca Guild, sitting with Sahagun's interpreter in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, trying to explain a system that no longer existed, using words that were being transcribed by someone who did not fully understand them, into a document that would be confiscated, partially destroyed, and not published for 300 years. Think about the last senator, no name recorded, probably old, probably very poor, probably accustomed to the specific loneliness of being someone whom everyone needed and no one wanted, carrying the ritual knowledge of a tradition no one had written down, no apprentice, no successor. When the last family called for them and they performed for the last time and walked back through the village avoiding every eye that carefully avoided theirs, no one marked that moment as an ending. No one knew it was the last time. These were not tragedies that anyone witnessed. They were endings that only became visible in retrospect, long after, when someone reached for the knowledge and found nothing. When a historian wrote, "We do not know how this was done." When a chemist wrote, "The formula has been lost." When a linguist wrote, "This script remains undeciphered." Each of those sentences, each of those quiet academic admissions of ignorance, is the sound of a human life that was not recorded. A knowledge tradition that died in a human mind without being written down. A professional lineage that ran unbroken for centuries, and then, without announcement, without memorial, without anyone noticing in the moment, stopped. These were human beings. They had families. They had worries. They had evenings after work. They were not symbols. They were not metaphors for the fragility of knowledge. They were people, and the world did not bother to remember their names. History preserves what power chooses to preserve. It records the names of emperors because emperors funded the record keepers. It documents battles because states needed to justify their violence. It archives the decisions of councils and the verdicts of courts because those institutions required their own legitimacy to be legible across time. It does not record, with equal care, the man who read the god's intentions in a warm liver, the woman who processed blue dye from fermenting leaves in a clay vat, the slave whose entire professional life was spent memorizing other people's names so that his owner could pretend to know them, the sinful, lonely, necessary figure who ate bread from a dead man's chest so that the dead man's family could sleep at night. It does not preserve the phonetic sound of a sacred Egyptian word that needed to be spoken correctly to work. It does not preserve the formula for a fire that could not be extinguished. It does not preserve the language of the Minoan scribes who recorded, faithfully, the goods and names and quantities of a civilization that was about to vanish. These 10 professions are not curiosities. They are not merely interesting footnotes in the history of labor. They are proof of something important and painful. Every civilization is larger than its archive. The lives that sustain the daily operations of every great empire, every great city, every great religious tradition, most of those lives are gone in a way that the emperors and generals are not gone, not because they mattered less, because no one with access to parchment and ink and a reason to write considered them worth the effort. Somewhere, in a clay tablet inscribed in a script no living human being can read, the last Minoan scribe recorded something. We will never know what. Somewhere, in a body buried without a marker in a Welsh churchyard whose name has been lost, the last senator lies. We do not know their name. These professions spoke. For centuries, they spoke. They performed and practiced and transmitted and taught and worked. And then the world stopped listening. And in the silence that followed, we learned what we had lost.